and gentlemen, welcome back to the TrueLife podcast. We are here with an amazing young woman all the way from Switzerland. She goes to the University of Fribourg. She's a doctoral researcher. She's a big fan of neuroscience, pharmacology, and she is a woman who is fond of something similar than everyone in my audience, and that is the world of psychedelics. And she's published a paper, and she's got an amazing insight on things. We're going to talk to her today. Miss Abigail Calder, how are you?
I'm wonderful. I'm slowly working on my coffee, getting better every second. And
Nice.
yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. This will be fun.
It's going to be fun. I figured I have learned in my life the best place to start is usually at the beginning. And so I thought we'd start there for this podcast here. What got you into, maybe you could first off explain a little bit more about yourself and then maybe tell us the journey that got you. What was it that made you fall in love with psychedelics?
Yeah, okay. Well, that might be a bit of a long story. I'll try to keep it not too long. So yeah, I'm a doctoral researcher in Freiburg, in Switzerland, and I study LSD. I'm actually from the United States. I grew up in Illinois, but I've lived in the German-speaking world, Germany, and now Switzerland for the past 8 years, I think. That's also its own story, but I'll try to stay focused. Yeah, so my interest in psychedelics, I'm not really sure where to start it because it goes really far back, I think, if I just look at my own history. The reason I studied psychology originally was because I was interested in altered states of consciousness. And through that interest, I eventually discovered psychedelics in the course of my studies. So basically, when I started studying psychology, I was interested in, this is hilarious to me now, but I was interested in maybe using other types of altered states of consciousness in therapy because I had noticed that I would spontaneously have lucid dreams as a kid and also a teenager. And I would feel really good all day after having one of those dreams. It was just awesome and like an epic story of a dream, and I could control it. And I came into my psychology studies originally with the very naive idea of trying to use lucid dreaming in therapy. But I quickly learned that that was not going to happen because it's very difficult to teach someone to lucid dream. Some people can kind of do it. Some people, it's really difficult. So I abandoned that idea relatively quickly, but it's still pretty funny to me that I came into psychology with that idea. It was like so close to what I ended up doing. But then I got really into hard science. I don't know that I was that scientific of a person when I came into my studies originally, but I was just really attracted to the pursuit of truth objectively. And I noticed, as objectively as you can. And I found it very interesting to dissect my own biases and dissect the way I'm making mistakes in my thinking or lying to myself or whatever. And that was very interesting. And I was also very inspired by other scientists who were just really into their topic. Like if you've ever heard Carl Sagan talk about astronomy, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, that. And that's certainly in abundance in the field of psychedelics. But anyway, I studied psychology, I studied neuroscience. And then at some point in the middle of my neuroscience studies in Germany, I discovered this research at Johns Hopkins where they were inducing an altered state of consciousness with a drug. And I think psychedelics had kind of been on my radar before because of meditation. I've been meditating for, I don't even know how many years now, off and on. I'm a bad meditator, but it's been a long-term interest of mine. And I would keep hearing in meditation circles that people took psychedelics and that it deepened their practice. And I think I was kind of skeptical at first, like, yeah, sure. Do you really have to take psychedelics in order to be better at meditation? I don't know about that. But it was on my radar. So I was a bit open to the idea of psychedelics. And then I came across this research at Johns Hopkins and I thought, whoa, you can actually do that? Like you can actually research that? And then so I just went down the rabbit hole with the modern research. I, of course, read How to Change Your Mind, which came out at almost exactly that same time. And I was just hooked. I can't explain it. I didn't really know what I wanted to study going forward after my master's studies. I wasn't even sure I wanted to do a PhD, but then I found my topic. So that's the short version.
That's a great story. And It's interesting. I love hearing how people get to the spot they're at. First off, it's an inspiring story. And when I hear that, I kind of hear the marriage of the dreamer and the hard sciences, and it's so cool how you found that come together.
Exactly. That's how I would describe it, Yeah. I didn't have to fully leave behind those earlier interests, They were there for a reason.
I think that is something that makes people successful, because too many people, I don't want to say they give up, but they're willing to sacrifice what they're passionate about for money, or they're willing to sacrifice what really gets them going for something that's all right. And so when you know what I mean by that, and you found psychedelics. So that's can I ask you what, you don't have to share this, but I'm curious, what were the lucid dreams you have? Do you remember the landscape or what you were doing in them?
Oh yeah. I kept a dream journal, so I still have everything. Yeah.
That's so awesome.
Yeah. I think it was, high school was rough for a lot of us, right? I think for me, they were a way to escape. And I actually taught myself to have really long lucid dreams. Yeah. I was that weirdo. I would even bring my dream journal to class. It was super, super weird for everybody else. But yeah, so often it was landscapes. Often I was flying or swimming. There was a lot of water. It was just, they were often really long. Sometimes there were battles. I think I was also into video games at the time. And so if I was playing a zombie game, there would be zombies and we would fight in the lucid dream, and it was all fun shooting zombies. Yeah, awesome. Just lots of different stuff.
When you said you would train yourself to do it, how did you do that? If let's say there's a young Abigail out there somewhere, or a young George Monty, and they're like, these people are kind of cool, and they hear you say you trained yourself. What advice would you give them? Or maybe you can talk about how you did it.
That's actually how I got into meditation, funnily enough. The problem with lucid dreaming is, okay, let's get into this. When you realize you're lucid dreaming, you often get excited. And that excitement wakes you up. So it doesn't last very long. So the first thing I had to learn to do was to stay calm and just present and aware once I realized that I'm dreaming, and to not over control the dream or get too excited about it. So I started to briefly meditate during the day. And apparently, if you read a lot, think a lot, write a lot about dreams, it makes it more likely, first of all, that you'll remember them, which is the first step to lucid dreaming. And secondly, that you'll actually be able to control them. I don't really know why that is. The explanation I heard at the time was your brain realizes it's important and starts to pay more attention. But that's what I did. I just got really into the topic. I would also do so-called reality checks throughout the day, which also made me super weird at school. So I would look at my hand, for example, and count the fingers, because in your dream, you often have the wrong number of fingers, or they're way too long or something like that. And one thing that was actually quite helpful, which was part of the reason I stopped, was it really works to break up your sleep. So if you sleep for 5 or 6 hours, wake up briefly for half an hour, do something quiet, read a book, whatever, and then go back to sleep, then it's much more likely to happen that you have a lucid dream. But of course, that messes up your sleep schedule. Right. So I don't know if it's all that healthy in the long term. And that's why I stopped when I went to college, because I had an 8 a.m. class and it just wasn't feasible anymore.
Yeah, I always think of the way I heard it, an alternative to counting your fingers is to knock on something. Is this real? Is this real? Is this real? Because then when you're in your dream, you're like, oh, there's a totem there. There's something I can see.
Or you try to remember how you got there, because in a dream you can't remember how you got here.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I heard an interesting tidbit today that said when you really understand another language, you can dream in that language. Do you ever dream in German?
Yeah.
That's so awesome.
It's often mixed. I think I also switch throughout the day, because my boyfriend is German. We live together, and we're just switching all day. And then sometimes at work I just switch, because why not? Everyone speaks English anyway.
Yeah.
But then often my dreams are mixed. Yeah.
That's awesome. So if we shift gears, so you come over there and you decide, you read some. Was there maybe another book, or was it that particular book that kind of drew you to psychedelics, or maybe there was some other literature in there?
It really was How to Change Your Mind, because I remember finishing that book and being so hungry for more, and there wasn't more yet. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to go make them more.
That's so awesome.
I don't think there was another book that I discovered super early. Oh, maybe Sam Harris wrote this book called Waking Up, and he talks about his MDMA experiences in that book. So I think I'd read that a couple years before, but that probably really opened my mind to the idea, because he really talks about MDMA and psychedelic experiences as part of a spiritual path or part of a meditative path. He also talks about a horrible trip he had, so it's balanced. But yeah, that was probably an influence on me as well.
Right. Have you read like one of my favorite go-tos is like Terrence McKenna, like the the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss and Food of the Gods.
I tried to read Food of the Gods. I have to be honest. I tried to read it. I made it maybe a third of the way through.
Right. What turned you off about it?
Yeah. Well, what I was gonna study actually was evolutionary genetics. So like what I really wanted to study, which I'm pretty sure is not very easy at all, was the genetics of human ancestors. I was really interested in evolution and ancient history. And so I had a bit of an interest in evolutionary biology. And when I read that book, having taken some classes in genetics and evolution, I was just like, I can't take this. I just didn't think it was all that plausible. Although I really liked the anthropological parts of that book, because I feel like that was where he really shines. That was his field of expertise. But as far as the Stoned Ape theory and stuff, I actually couldn't read it. I'm sorry.
I hear you. There's a lot of dichotomies in there, and it's, for me, I can't help it. I'm so drawn into the ideas of what can be versus the ideas of what today are. And I guess who else I turn to is maybe, what about Aldous Huxley? Have you read like The Island or Brave New World or some of these times where they introduce these things in there? What did you think about those?
Yeah, I read Doors of Perception after I developed this interest in psychedelics. I had read Brave New World long before that, and so I didn't really make the connection there. My friends have been pushing me to read The Island,
You gotta read it.
or Island, is it, whatever it's called. It's on my list. But yeah, Doors of Perception was really interesting to hear this firsthand account from a really, really prolific and skilled writer about psychedelics. Yeah. And he wrote another book. I forget what it was called. It wasn't about psychedelics, but there was a quote from it that seemed like it could be about psychedelics, and it hit me so hard that I actually framed it in my house. I have it in the other room.
What does it say? What's the quote?
See if I can remember it. Put me on the spot here.
Of course.
Yeah. So it says, I don't remember the context at all. In fact, I had the feeling that I didn't understand this book at all. I need to go back and read it. But the quote was, on the surface, I'm paraphrasing here, on the surface, there is the waves and the spray, the turbulence, but there is dark peace in the depths. Wow. Which by some strange paradox is the source and substance of the storm at the surface.
That's beautiful.
Talking about the mind. Yeah. And for me, that quote seemed to really relate to meditation and maybe psychedelics. And it was just, it was at the very end of the book. I had read this book. I didn't understand it at all. I was frustrated with myself. And then in the end, he hits me with that quote. And I was like, okay, this is enough of a reason to have read this book. So
I'm curious to what it is. I hope when we're over with this, I would love for you to send me the title of it so I could read it as well.
Absolutely. It'll come to me.
Okay. Nice.
I can look it up. Honestly, I can just look it up right now.
Yeah, why not? That'd be
awesome.
Aldous
Huxley books. Yeah. Meanwhile, you can.
I'll ask. Okay. Yeah. So, I'm wondering, have you ever had a meditative experience? Like I remember reading, I can't think of where I read it, but it was some book, and they talked about a really deep meditation and a psychedelic experience and some of the similarities there. And I forget the guy's name. However, he was saying that a deep psychedelic experience is similar to someone who has been meditating for a long period of time and is able to find themselves in these states. And I'm wondering if, I think some of the brain scans And I'm just kind of throwing this out here. I don't have any brain scans to map it up. I think I read it somewhere. So you can maybe shoot me in the right direction here. But I think I remember reading somewhere that you see similar types of activity in the brain from deep meditation and psychedelic experiences. Does that sound like it could be plausible to you?
Yeah, that's possible. So the Aldous Huxley book, by the way, is called Eyeless in Gaza.
That sounds beautiful.
Yeah.
Write that down.
I recommend the last 5 pages. The rest I didn't understand. I need to go back. Yeah, as far as meditation, the thing that comes to mind is something called jhana meditation. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, in normal meditation, right, you focus often on the breath or on any other relatively neutral, constant experience. And in jhana meditation, which I'm not good at all, you do that as well. But then once you've reached a certain state of focus, a certain state of concentration, you shift your attention to some sensation in the body that's pleasant. And you make that your object of meditation. And what happens then is that this feeling of pleasure spreads throughout your entire body, almost like an explosion. Honestly, almost like an orgasm. I'm not going to lie. And it's the same, it spreads throughout your entire body. And then something changes in your mind as well. And you're definitely in this altered state of consciousness. What usually happens to me when that happens in meditation is I get really excited, which completely destroys this whole state. Because jhana meditation is very difficult to learn without a retreat, I think, or at least an instructor. I tried to learn it from a book after it happened to me randomly once in meditation, which I think is how a lot of people get to it. It's very easy to accidentally do it once and then almost never be able to do it again. But if you can really maintain this concentration and calm focus, you can stay in that state for quite some time and use it as basically a meditative state. And I think there's some similarities probably between that and psychedelics because your body feels extremely good. You're in this extremely clear state of mind. There's some also dissociation from the world around you to some degree. There's no visual hallucinations or other such pyrotechnics, but when it comes to meditation and psychedelics, what I really see as common between them is being in the moment, because psychedelics also kind of force people into the moment. They enhance sensory perception. They enhance the perception of what is here right now, and then they reduce abstract thought or thought about the future and the past. Well, I mean, not completely, but the sensory perception is very, very enhanced on psychedelics. So people often feel like they're very in the moment. And that's what meditation does as well. And there's some similarity between them, obviously, not a complete overlap, but yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that is like, there's so much different language from so many people from different educational backgrounds when they explain the trip that they use. And sometimes I think that can be lost in, interpretation means translation, right? So when we're talking between cultures or people or educational backgrounds, concepts can get kind of muddled. And a lot of the ones I hear sometimes is this thing called ego death. And it sounds to me what you explained about being in the present may be something similar to that. How do you think those two things mesh together?
That's a good question.
Thank you.
The difficulty is psychedelics do more than one thing in the brain. Oh dear, that makes it very hard to parse together. So, yeah, I think this can also happen in meditation, right? If you become completely in the moment, it's almost like there's no room for your sense of self anymore. But in my experience in meditation, it's a lot more subtle. It doesn't feel like a death. It's just, or it doesn't feel like losing control. It's just simply not there. And there's no story there. It's just not there because you're focused in the present. And then as soon as you stand up, it comes back. It's not dramatic at all. Psychedelics make a big drama out of it. And I think this is probably also influenced by you mentioned culture.
Right.
The effects of psychedelics are very obviously influenced by culture as well, and about what people understand about the substances. So if somebody knows the term ego death and maybe they would like to have one, I think it's more likely to happen. In ayahuasca ceremonies, for example, it happens a lot less often than it does like in a study where we talk about it beforehand, or in a therapeutic setting where especially when they talk about it beforehand, because that's just not how ayahuasca is really used. People feel like they're communicating with entities or with spirits or with plants, but there's still something of them there to communicate. They're not dead. I mean, not like it can't happen, but it's less frequent.
Yeah. So, God, I got all these things that are running through my mind, and I go off on tangents sometimes. So forgive me if I just start.
Let's go on a tangent.
Running. Okay. Okay. Then let me just jerk the wheel over this way. I'm thinking of books because that's what I do sometimes. What about Rick Strassman? Have you read some of what he's been writing?
Yeah,
please.
Yeah, I read DMT, the Spirit Molecule. Or you know what? That might be another one I didn't finish. This is a problem. Part of my problem is I always read 10 books at once. I can't just keep one. I can't focus on one. I like to have 10 that I'm currently reading.
I love it.
So Rick, that story is really interesting and a little bit creepy to me, frankly, because he's, Rick Strassman is this conventional doctor type, and then he starts giving people DMT, and then they all have these experiences of, I don't remember what it was, entities, some kind of entities that feel absolutely real. And it really, you can tell that it shook him up a little bit, so that was fascinating.
Yeah. I thought that maybe his harder science background, where he's in a lab, he's clinical, everything's there, he's marking it down, and I thought that one might resonate with you a little bit. And I wanted to see what you thought about the beings in there. I was really fortunate because I got to talk to him a little bit. And in one of his newer books, he really went deep on the Hebrew Bible. And when I questioned him on that, I was like, what was it? Like, what are you studying in this Hebrew Bible? Like, what is this entities? And he says, you know what, George? I want people to be aware of that which they are talking to, or that which they are interacting with. And I think that these entities described in this literature are the closest possible things to what people are talking to. And if people can be aware of that which they're talking to, the conversation will be much better for them. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. I mean, I see a real, a kind of split when talking about entities. There's some people think that they are only real to the person experiencing them, and some people think they are real outside of the person experiencing them, like that they really exist somewhere. I'm not sure which camp Rick Strassman is in. I haven't, but it's really cool that you got to talk to him.
I'm so stoked.
Yeah. So for me, in order for me to believe that they would be real outside of the person experiencing them, the bar for evidence for that for me is extremely high.
Sure.
Right now, I would think that they're generated by that person's brain, and that they are, basically only real to that person, because we already know that the brain can generate personalities. If you want to write a novel, for example, you can think up a character for that novel. You can just make a person. You can imagine a person. My guess would be that this ability of the brain to make up personalities or creatures is just somehow enhanced on DMT. And have you ever had the feeling that you're being watched, that there's some kind of presence in the room, even though there's nothing there?
Yeah.
There must be a part of the brain that generates that. And my guess would be that DMT is maybe stimulating that.
Right.
So it has a little bit of a different effect than, say, LSD, because entity experiences on LSD are not very frequent. So maybe DMT is doing something special that other psychedelics aren't doing as much. But that would be my guess, is it's stimulating the brain's ability to create personalities and this feeling of presence. And people also feel that it's very real, right? They feel it's more real than reality. But that's, they say in cognitive behavioral therapy, feelings aren't facts. And for me, that's a cool experience. And, but I'm not sure that just because it feels real, that doesn't mean it really is. There's a part of your brain generating that too. Maybe DMT is just poking it.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, Abigail, let's say me and you were like, we're going to get to the bottom of this. We're going to design a clinical trial to measure this. Like, what would that look like in your opinion?
Well, you'd have to have some way to, like, if you wanted to measure entity experiences. When we measure subjective experiences like that with psychedelics, we usually just ask people about them, either with an interview or with a questionnaire, or those two things. So you'd have to, first of all, obtain ethical approval for the study. Just getting practical here. That might not be so easy. And, Rick Strassman's experiments, he wrote in his book that he did them in a hospital in a very clinical setting. I wonder if that maybe was a bit of a negative influence on the study participants, which he couldn't have known at the time because it was very early in the research. In our study, for example, the LSD study, we do what they did at Johns Hopkins. We have a living room like set up with a comfy chair and a nice bed and some pictures on the walls. We have a carpet in there. Like it looks like some weird hybrid between a clinic room and a living room, but it's a little bit cozy, So I would want to have a setting like that. You'd have to get DMT and then give people DMT and measure. I would want to know, for example, how often these entity experiences really happen. You'd have to not mention them beforehand. I think that would be very important. Like, don't tell people beforehand you might have an entity experience.
No
Just
priming.
be very, yeah. So make sure they understand that DMT is a very, very, very altered state of consciousness. It's not just getting high. You might be in another world entirely. It might be very different from anything you've ever experienced. But beyond that, be very vague. So they know what to expect. They're not going to be blindsided by this altered state, but then you're not priming them to experience an entity. And then you would measure with your interview or your questionnaire whether they experienced any kind of entity, and if so, what it was like and how they felt it was real. If you wanted to know which parts of the brain were active during that time, that would get very difficult because you'd have to stick them in an MRI on DMT. And frankly, I don't really want to do that.
That sounds horrible.
Yeah, it's possible that it's been done. So there have been a couple of studies that used intravenous DMT, which lasts as long as you have the IV in, basically. So if someone was calm enough and had no claustrophobia whatsoever, maybe you could get away with it. People do MRI studies with people on psychedelics, but DMT is pretty crazy. I don't know,
yeah.
I think you'd have to pay careful attention.
Any confined space, like I don't even want to be in the back of a car if I'm in a deep experience like that. It's the confinement to me feels so much more confining.
Yeah. I don't really like MRIs anyway, so I wouldn't really want to be in one on psilocybin but I've talked to the researchers who do that and basically asked them, how do you make sure people don't freak out in the MRI? And they say most of the time it actually goes pretty well. First of all, they screen anybody out who has any difficulty with an MRI or enclosed spaces. And then they say, most people think that the noise in there is a little bit calming. Like there's this boom, 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 boom noise the whole time. And one of my acquaintances who does research with MRI told me that sometimes when the participants come out of the MRI, they feel like they're being born.
Wow. I guess the heartbeat in there, it kind of seems like a womb, maybe. It could be like a womb.
Yeah, it seems like a womb. And people have probably heard these stories of people experiencing a birth-like experience on psychedelics. And so maybe they connect it with what they've heard. And then they have this experience of getting born from the MRI.
Wow. That's crazy to think about.
Yeah.
So what was there something particular about LSD? Like, is that the one you want to work with, or do you like all of them, or are you just choosing this one for now? Or
I would have happily worked with any psychedelic. In fact, the way I got my PhD was extremely random. I just got really lucky. So I decided right before the coronavirus pandemic that I wanted to look for a PhD in the field of psychedelics. Like fall 2019, I started looking. And so obviously it took a very, very long time because everything was shut down during Corona. Nobody was hiring and nobody knew what was going on. And I just basically started writing a bunch of different potential PhD advisors, including people who weren't yet working with psychedelics, who I thought might be open to it. And that is how I found my current PhD advisor. I wrote him because he'd done some studies on ketamine. And so I was asking about ketamine because I thought, close enough. Psychedelic enough. Yeah. And as it turns out, he wrote me back to say, I'm thinking of doing a study on LSD. And I was like, why? Yes. Please let me apply to be your PhD student. So that was just an incredible stroke of luck. And I would have also happily studied psilocybin or DMT or any other psychedelic drug. In fact, I really like drug research in general. In my master's degree, I researched with cannabis in mice. I just like almost the simplicity of adding a drug to a system and seeing what happens.
Yeah, I like the way
psychedelics. A lot happens.
Yeah, it's sometimes is it because simple things are elegant, or like what is it what is it there?
Um, yeah, good question. I think I just like the simplicity of the experiment.
Mm.
I don't know if I'm somehow just a bit cognitively lazy, but it's a very easy experimental design, and the results are often quite complicated.
Right.
But at the end of the day, you're just adding one little substance to the brain or to the liver or whatever it is and seeing what happens. And there's
For
just I can't explain why that fascinates me. It just does.
it I think it's fascinating to hear why you're fascinated by it, if that makes any sense. Does it sometimes I think when I read these studies, it amazes me like the things we're learning about it, and when you get to see the scans light up, or you get to see what looks like the the sounds being processed in the visual cortex, or sight being processed over here by Broca's area or something like that. And but I'm wondering for you, does it take away any of the magic, or maybe it adds to the magic when you have been studying what happens in the brain and then you
Mm.
have a psychedelic experience? Does that enhance your experience, or does it take away from your experience?
The scientific study definitely doesn't take away from the mystery
Okay.
because we still barely understand
Right.
psychedelics. There's that's another reason I think I was attracted to this field is because it's so new. I had thought beforehand about maybe doing aging research before
Mm.
I came across the Johns Hopkins studies, but that field is so full of people. Um, I didn't feel like I could really make a difference. But in this
Mm.
field, there's so much low hanging fruit because there's so much we just don't know
Right.
that we just really don't know. And so I felt like maybe I could actually make a difference. And so that's why the mystery is not gone. I think I have job security forever as a scientist because there's so much we don't know. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not going to be done in my lifetime.
Well, not only that, like, but you have an opportunity to be a pioneer in a field right here. You know what? And
Mm,
like, as I'm thinking about this, the same way you married, the same way you married dreaming with psychedelics, I think you're going to marry psychedelics with aging, because I think you're going to be able to find that some of these things, some of the research that you are doing, Mrs. Abigail, I think you're going to see a lot of profound work on Alzheimer's and some of these age related diseases. I think we're going to see that there. And I think I'm going to see your name next to some of that research in the future.
my lab is actually quite interested in that. There's another PhD student in my lab who's gonna head that project. But it's so cool. So in my LSD study, if I can talk about that,
Yeah,
we're
please.
studying whether LSD enhances neuroplasticity in healthy people.
Right.
And I took a relatively young cohort because I didn't know what would happen with the older people because neuroplasticity tends to decline with age. After the age of about 55 or so, you see a slow decline. So I took everybody up to the age of 55, but we may be planning a study with an older cohort just to be able to compare. Because one of two things could happen, right? It could be that the brain is less sensitive to LSD and therefore less likely to benefit from it. Or it could be that because there's a deficit in neuroplasticity, that LSD can partially correct that, which would be incredible. Like we don't know that yet. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but it's a really exciting thing to research.
Are you leaning one way or the other? Like, what, or can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's just no data on it. There's a study at Johns Hopkins where they took people who are, I think, older and who have depression, but also have some mild cognitive decline or
Right.
impairment. And so they're treating the depression with psilocybin, and then they're going to see if it also helps the mild cognitive impairment, which is a great study design because then they can offer a relatively well-known benefit, this potential treatment for depression, but then also see if it fixes other things. So I'm waiting for the data on that. I don't really know. As far as Alzheimer's, to be honest, I don't think psychedelics are going to cure Alzheimer's disease because the problem with Alzheimer's disease is dead cells, and psychedelics don't resurrect dead cells. They help existing cells grow new connections. So I don't know if it could maybe improve the symptoms to some small degree, but you would really need another treatment additionally in order to cure it. So that's where I'm at with Alzheimer's right now. But whatever deficit there is with neuroplasticity, it could be that a drug that stimulates neuroplasticity might slightly correct it. We'll see.
Yeah. It's here's what I think. And I am nowhere near a scientist, but I love thinking about what can be. And
Mm.
so it seems to me that the same way, the same mechanism of action that allows someone who has PTSD to work through that PTSD in 1 or 2 sessions, I think the same mechanism of action should be able to help solve the cognitive decline, because but isn't that what neuroplasticity is doing? Aren't you kind of like bypassing certain parts that could be dead, or you're reworking memories, or you're reworking through trauma? Isn't that the same way we can solve like cognitive decline? If we can teach the brain to, or if we can allow the brain to process information in other parts or bypass the dead parts, isn't that kind of the same mechanism?
It's almost, it's half right. So yeah, so if, for example, if someone has a stroke, what happens to them is that parts of their brain actually die off because they're choked of oxygen. They're basically choke, and those cells die. But that person can sometimes recover because the parts of the brain that are still alive can learn to compensate for the parts that are missing. But as you probably know, that recovery process is limited. Some people don't completely recover. And with psychedelics, this is also a bit of a question that we've been thinking about in our lab recently, if psychedelics could be used in neurorehabilitation. To me, I'm agnostic on it so far. We'll see. But perhaps they could help the brain compensate for dead cells. But that process is limited without psychedelics. And I think it's probably also limited with psychedelics, even if you can raise the limit a little bit. So as far as Alzheimer's disease, for example, the reason that cells are dying and continue to die is not addressed by psychedelics. So even if you could maybe prolong somebody's cognitive health span, for example, that's what I think is maybe the best case scenario. But at some point, the cell death is still going to catch up with them. So you'd have to stop the cell death. That's the cure for Alzheimer's, is you have to stop cells from dying. And we're not sure how to do that yet.
I got your picture has frozen up on me, but I can still talk.
Yeah, I see that too. maybe if I turn off the video and turn it on again.
Okay, yeah, give it a try.
I wasn't sure if it was also for you. Oh God, I'm still, and I have a stupid look on my face too. Don't I?
You don't have a beautiful look on your face. Are you kidding me?
I look worried.
You look questioning, like,
yeah.
Is that right, George?
Yeah. I don't know. I guess we just have to live with it, eh?
Let me try it on my side. I'm gonna remove it, and then we'll see if it comes back. Oh, nope, we're still there. Okay.
Oh, there I am.
You're back.
Yes, nice. Problem solving.
Okay. Yeah, that's how we do it. So I want to get into this paper that you wrote. I think it's really awesome, and I'm excited to talk about it. And I know that you have presented it at least once, and you've been to some other places, maybe introducing people. But so one of the first parts that I kind of wrote down some of the questions that you addressed in your profile. And the first question was, do psychedelics enhance neuroplasticity? And maybe for people that may not know, maybe we should try to define what neuroplasticity is before we talk about that.
Oh, yes. So neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to rewire itself, basically, to form new connections, to adapt based on experience. Every experience you have changes your brain, and that's possible because of neuroplasticity. So at the molecular level, if we want to get down under the microscope, that comprises a few different things. One of them is the birth of new cells, new neurons, which happens in certain areas of the brain. It looks like the hippocampus and the olfactory area, which is responsible for smell processing. The rest of the brain, in humans at least, does not appear to grow new brain cells. You have the brain cells you have, and if you kill them, it sucks to be you. But what neuroplasticity also means is that the cells that exist can grow new connections with each other and also delete old ones that aren't useful anymore. So neurons, if you've ever seen a picture of one, they have these branches. It almost looks like a tree. Yeah. And those branches are called dendrites, and they connect to other neurons at synapses, which is the name for those connections. And those synapses can change. So new ones can grow, new dendrites can grow, new synapses can form. The synapses can also change in their strength, which basically means how many receptors are there at the synapse that are responding to chemical neurotransmitters. Stop me if I'm getting too technical. And so those are a bunch of different aspects of neuroplasticity. It comprises a few different processes in the brain.
And so, according to your study in your paper, in your opinion, in your research, do psychedelics enhance neuroplasticity?
It appears so. It's a good theory, is
Okay.
what I would say as a scientist. There's quite a bit of evidence for it in animals. Not as much as you would like, but there are quite a few studies that seem to show that even in a petri dish, if you give LSD, for example, or DMT or ketamine, that the neurons grow new branches and new connections with each other. So it seems to be that that's the case. However, many of these studies have been done in rats and mice, or pigs, I think once, or cells in a dish. So the applicability to humans is still a little bit in question for me. I would guess that it's also happening in humans. There's some indication in human studies that it maybe is. There's some support for the theory. But for me, the jury is still a little bit out on that, even though it really appears to be the case. For me, the more important question is not, do psychedelics enhance neuroplasticity, but if they do, what does it mean? Does it matter? So I think psychedelics probably do enhance neuroplasticity even in humans, but I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah, that's a tough question, but I think it matters. Like, I think it more than matters. And I think that there are some sort of anecdotal ideas about it. Like, there's been studies where, I think it was Francis Crick that came up with the double helix, right? And there's tons of studies where people have taken LSD or taken a psychedelic and had this epiphany. Maybe they were studying it before, or I think the gentleman that discovered the shape of the benzene rings was just thinking about it, and then all of a sudden on some psychedelic substance, boom, there's these 7 girls dancing, and boom, there you go, benzene.
Wow, I hadn't heard that before, but that's ironic. That's funny. Yeah, so there's no question that neuroplasticity itself matters. The question with psychedelics is, how much are they enhancing neuroplasticity? Is it just a little bit so that we can measure that there's a significant difference, but it maybe doesn't make a difference in that person's life? Or is it really enough to make a difference? And another interesting thing about neuroplasticity is it's not so easy to determine what it feels like. Like if you have a more neuroplastic brain, if your brain is more capable of making new connections than usual, what does that feel like to you? Can you tell? And there's been very little research on that. I tried to find some. The main thing that you might notice is that you would learn faster or learn better. Yeah. But sometimes people will try to anecdotally relate neuroplasticity to changes in mood, like the afterglow effect after a psychedelic experience where people feel good for a week or two afterward. I know of no evidence that that's based on neuroplasticity. It could be something else because psychedelics do more than one thing in the brain.
What about reading comprehension? Like, could we measure it that way? Could you, I think it's cumulative. I think the more you, I am just pulling this right out of my ass, but I don't know, but I think it's cumulative. I think that the more you do, the more connections you make. It just sounds to me that that's the way memories are made, right? Like the more you study something, the stronger that connection. And if we run with that and we say, okay, this person is doing, I don't know, 8 grams every Saturday and then a microdose during the week, wouldn't it make sense that you are continuing to use these new connections more and more, and they're getting stronger and stronger? Is that a valid hypothesis?
Maybe. However, neuroplasticity is very tightly regulated in the brain. There is a maximum. Okay. You can probably have too much. So
what does that mean if you have too much? Like, what,
if
you're not thinking of anything?
If your brain was too plastic, here's what I think would happen. You would adapt and perhaps over-adapt to every new thing that happens to you. So new events would kind of overwrite old ones and not become as integrated into your previous learning history, to put a rather technical term on it. So let's say I'm a relatively emotionally stable person with good social relationships. Let's just say that. I'm not saying it's true, but let's just say that. And then if I were to take a lot of psychedelics and really hit the maximum of neuroplasticity and maybe have too much, which the brain doesn't allow, but let's say it happened. And the next day I have a really awful experience with another person. Well, I might learn maladaptively that interactions with other people are always going to be that awful. I'm over adapting to the new experience. And then as soon as I have a good experience with someone, I'll adapt to that and assume it's always that way. And so the way neuroplasticity normally works is, yes, you adapt a little bit to new experiences, but they're also integrated into your previous history. They're integrated into the network of connections that's already there. If you had too much neuroplasticity, you would be over adapting, over fitting your model of the world to new experiences. So that wouldn't necessarily be good.
Maybe, or Abigail, what about this one? maybe what would happen is that you could shift where you want to have that memory. Maybe you could shift your ability to process. Maybe if you had enough neuroplasticity, then you could manage where you're processing that information. You'd be like, okay, I've had these experiences with these people, and now I've had these experiences with these people. I can shift between them. Maybe you could consciously shift where you want to process that information. How's that?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I don't know if you can consciously control. I mean,
maybe
I'd have to think about that one. But anyway, the brain stops you from hitting that limit of neuroplasticity and over adapting. It controls it very tightly. So there is a limit probably, and at some point, no matter how many psychedelics you take, you'll hit the limit, and it just doesn't go over that probably. Also, if you took psilocybin every day, you might have heart problems. Just throwing that out there.
Wow. Okay, I want to talk about that. Why is that?
Because psilocybin and I think other psychedelics as well, they stimulate the 5-HT2B receptor, serotonin 2B, which has been associated with, I forget exactly which heart problem. But, there's no data on this, but in animal models, drugs that stimulate serotonin 2B tend to cause, I think, valvular heart disease or something like that. And so that's a concern that some scientists have about microdosing right now, especially if you do it like really every day for a long time, that it could long-term lead to some kind of heart issue.
Have you ever heard of someone taking a large dose of psilocybin and then having a heart attack?
No, I have not. Yeah, it seems to be more an issue with chronic administration. So not one big dose, but I mean, if you take enough LSD, some of your organs are going to fail. At some point, there is a dose that does that. This is a fun, maybe you've heard of this, but every once in a while, like maybe every 10 years, there's a case report in the medical literature in which like almost the same thing happens. There's some people at a party, they want to do some cocaine, and they snort a white powder that they believe is cocaine, and it turns out it's LSD. And so they get a massive overdose of LSD, and then they end up in the hospital with various complications from that. But nobody's ever died.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe if you really massively overdose yourself, I'm not sure what would fail first, but potentially.
What's the LD50 on that? Do you know?
For humans, I'm not sure. So these people in the case reports, they'll take like. Yeah,
it's so crazy to think of someone snorting like a big line of
a few grams, like whatever the cocaine dose is that you take. I don't know what it is. I've never done cocaine, but a few grams of LSD, and they very clearly need medical attention. So nobody died, but they were all hospitalized, and for some of them, it seems like they would have died without medical intervention. So I don't know, a few grams.
That might be too much neuroplasticity, right?
Yeah, that might be too much of everything.
It's so crazy. I want to read, like, there's going to be tons of stuff I'm going to want you to send me out of this, but I'm going to put that on the back note. Like that is and it shouldn't be funny, but it is funny. So
it is kind of, it's, you can laugh or you can cry.
Right. Let me write that. Okay. So when we, at the beginning, we were talking about psychedelics and the neuroplasticity, and you had mentioned the way it was done sometimes in petri dishes and other times in different sort of animal models. What mechanism, how did you in your paper study this process?
Well, it's a review paper. So I basically tried to find every single study ever on psychedelics and neuroplasticity and summarize them. I had some questions that I wanted answered, which ended up just being the questions that are the headlines in the paper. And actually, I wasn't necessarily planning on writing this paper when I started my PhD. I knew I was going to be studying psychedelics and neuroplasticity. And I started out by reading the literature on that and reading other reviews on that. And this paper that I wrote was partially born of frustration, to be honest, because I noticed a couple of problematic patterns in other papers that I was reading. One was that papers that found null results on neuroplasticity were often not mentioned at all. And I knew they existed because I happened to know the researchers who did them. So for example, sometimes, do you know the term BDNF? Brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
Right. Okay.
So it's this marker of neuroplasticity. It's a protein in the brain. It stimulates neuroplasticity, basically. And it is also present in human blood. So in studies, sometimes people will try to measure the impact of, say, LSD on neuroplasticity by measuring its impact on BDNF. So they want to see if there's more or less BDNF in the blood after giving LSD. And sometimes you find an increase, and sometimes you find no change at all or even a slight decrease. So it's pretty unreliable BDNF, unfortunately. The researchers I know who work with it also say that. But in review papers that are, making the case that psychedelics stimulate neuroplasticity in humans, they almost never mention the papers that have null results. And that's like half of them. So that was a bit frustrating for me, and I made sure to mention them in my review. And I felt like I didn't trust the literature anymore. Like
Right.
if all of these null results are just not being mentioned, how do I know that I know anything about neuroplasticity? I need to go dive deep into the literature and research this. And the other thing that was a bit frustrating was I kept seeing in scientific articles this claim that psilocybin enhances neurogenesis, which is the growth of new brain cells. And every time this was claimed, they would cite a particular paper showing that. It's from Catlow and colleagues, 2013. There's nothing wrong with this paper. I'm not going to shit on this paper, but maybe slightly shit on the people who cite it. So in this paper, here's what they did. They took some mice and they gave them psilocybin. They gave them a high dose of psilocybin and a low dose of psilocybin. And after that, they measured the effects on neurogenesis. They found that the high dose of psilocybin actually reduced neurogenesis significantly, which means that this effect was probably not random, or there was a low probability that it was a random find. So it's probably real. And then they found that a small dose of psilocybin non-significantly increased neurogenesis, which means non-significant just means it could have been random. You can't really say that it's a real effect. But the way this paper is cited is as evidence that psilocybin enhances neurogenesis. And that, for me, was kind of upsetting, because if you read this paper objectively, it shows that psilocybin is bad for neurogenesis. And people kept citing it to say the opposite. So I just got angry, and that was kind of how I wrote the review paper, was because I wanted to know what was really going on. And as far as neurogenesis, there's really zero evidence that psilocybin or LSD enhances neurogenesis, partially because it hasn't been very well studied. But so far, there's zero evidence. For DMT and 5-MeO-DMT, there's one paper each that shows that it appears to enhance neurogenesis, which is exciting, but it's also still just one paper. If you say DMT enhances neurogenesis, you're basing that statement on like 24 mice. And I don't like to base anything I say on 24 mice. So it's really not clear that psychedelics enhance neurogenesis at all, and it needs to be better studied because there's just not very many papers on it. Right.
I was going to ask about the dosing and being dose dependent, but I think we kind of covered it right there. Is it now in LSD and in DMT? Is there a difference in doses there? Like, is there a different study that you reviewed to hear about those two particular substances and dose dependent neurogenesis?
Yeah, so there were a couple of studies that just did ascending doses. It's really, really hard to compare doses between mice and humans. So if, a human dose of 100 micrograms LSD is a full trip, it's kind of hard to know what dose that is for mice. Because you can't ask them,
right?
Hey,
right.
mouse, are you tripping right now? So there's a couple things you can do to try to get an indicator.
Like a head twitch? Listen, don't they look at head twitches?
But it's not clear what the correlation between head twitch and hallucinations is.
I know, it's so crazy.
Yeah. And, humans kind of have that too. Humans get muscle twitches, in the LSD study, sometimes you see people shaking and stuff. And almost every animal that's been studied has something like that, like cats. They used to give LSD to cats back in the 60s. Poor cats. But they have this thing. They have also a physical effect. It's called abortive grooming, where they'll attempt to clean themselves. They'll put their little paw up to their face and start to lick it, and then they just stop.
What is that a measure of? What does that measure?
I don't know. It's just a funny apparently cats on LSD are having some epiphany about how they don't have to be clean. I don't know.
Is that 5 fingers on my paw? Is that 3 fingers?
Or with rats, you get sometimes, when a dog is wet, it'll shake itself
Yeah.
off. Rats do that on LSD. They'll shake like they're a wet dog. Yeah. So anyway, I'm going on a tangent now.
No, it's
But
awesome.
yeah. So a head twitch response shows that the drug is working, but it doesn't show that the animal is hallucinating.
Right.
In order to get some kind of subjective effect, what you can do is you can teach the animal to discriminate between being under the influence of a drug versus being sober. So you teach it to respond a certain way when it feels the drug and respond a different way when it doesn't. And so then you can tell like the threshold, basically. What's the threshold LSD dose for a mouse? Can it feel it, basically? Can it discriminate between being given the drug and not?
Well, you got to break that down for me. That's like a Pavlovian, like you're teaching them to respond. Like, I don't understand that. Can you say it again?
So let's imagine you've got a mouse and you've got two buttons in its cage. Let's just call it the red button and the green button. And normally when they press the red button, they get, let's say, food.
Okay.
And when they press the green button, nothing happens. And then you give them LSD and you change it. So now when they press the red button after getting LSD, nothing happens. And when they press the green button, they get a treat. And so what should happen if they feel the drug is they learn, as soon as I feel the drug, I have to press the green button. Otherwise, I press the red button in order to get my treat. And of course, there's some confounders there. Like at some point, if you give a mouse enough LSD, it's not going to do much at all. But they can be quite active if they're in a comfortable cage that they're familiar with, where it's not triggering a fear response. They can be, they're still active when they're on LSD. So you can use that to tell if the mouse feels the drug or not, because if it doesn't feel it, it's going to keep pushing the red button, even though it's
that makes much better
in the
sense.
test that you do after that. Yeah. So that's measure. Sorry.
No, it's all good. It's all good. I was just thinking, like, the rat in the cage seems a lot like the human in a clinical sort of room where he's all cooped up. You know what I mean? I wonder if there's some kind of response there. Not that it matters or anything.
I mean, it's not necessarily a natural environment for a rat.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And you know what? That affects neuroplasticity. If you keep a rat in a bare minimum cage with no friends, and then move him to what they call I think it's called an enriched environment, where he's got a lot of toys, lots of other rats. Rats really like other rats. They're very social. That will actually stimulate neuroplasticity. And actually, it would probably be more accurate to say that keeping the rat alone in a boring cage reduces neuroplasticity, because its natural state is to be with other rats and to be able to move around and have lots of things to explore. So that's for me a bit of a concern with some of the animal studies, is because you might have animals that are starting out with a reduced amount of neuroplasticity because of the way they're kept. It's a theory that could be happening. And so maybe they're more sensitive to changes in neuroplasticity as a result of a drug. I don't know. So that's why it's really important to translate the findings to humans, to try and figure out if it works in humans.
I know that what I'm about to say is really unscientific, and there's probably some really obvious reasons that, like, you don't do this. And I can think of a few of them, but I want to say it anyway. Like, I really think that first off, people that are providing psychedelic therapy for people, I'm a firm believer that person should have a lot of psychedelic experience. They should have their own trips. They should be, if they're administering ketamine, they should have gone through hours of ketamine. If they're doing LSD, they should have done hours of LSD. And I think there's some research that can be done if you yourself as a scientist take that substance and then write down your notes. I think it's way better to ask yourself than a rat. Better to ask yourself than a mouse. Like, why aren't we doing more of that?
Yeah, well, the great thing about rats and mice, which actually it's not a great thing, is that after you dose them, you are allowed to take their brain out of their head, kill the animal, and to research it. And so if you want to look at, if I sit around and think about the molecular mechanisms of psychedelics and don't do any experiments, I'm probably going to come up with some bullshit, to be honest. Like, because you really have to study the brain. And so if you want to study neurogenesis, for example, with animal studies, you have to take the brain out of the head. You have to take it out, slice it up into little pieces, and look at it under a microscope.
You have to do that to verify, right? Like, I mean, if you really want that hard data, you want to know for sure, then that's what you have to do.
Yeah, that's what you have to do. I don't know of a way to do that in humans. Maybe there's, yeah, it would be really, really difficult. Because you'd have to use some kind of imaging that so in animals, what you do is you give a fluorescent marker that marks the newly born cells.
Mm-hmm.
And then you count how many there are basically after you give the drug versus after you give no drug. And in order to look at the fluorescent cells, you have to take the brain out of the head and slice it up into lots of little thin slices and look at it under a microscope. In humans, as far as I know, there's no technique to do that whatsoever.
Okay, what if we could do something like this? I'm wondering if you have an idea of how many theories match findings in this particular area with rats.
Ooh. I don't. I mean, in general, in science, there's a lot of dead theories.
Yeah, totally. And mine is a total dead theory too. But it seems to me, I think maybe you could almost visualize what's happening. Like, I think that there's, oh God, I'm such a just bullshitter. But like, I think it's. It doesn't matter what the hell I think. It doesn't matter what I think. I'll get back to you on this study. I'll think about it a little bit longer, and I'll get back to you. So this paper that you wrote, this summary of this paper, where does this fit in onto where you're at with your PhD? Is this like the first one, or is there something specific that your PhD is about? How does this fit in to what the long-term goal of your PhD is going to be?
Mm-hmm. This is the first one, exactly. So this is me reviewing the literature, trying to figure out what we know about neuroplasticity and what is still important to find out. And so some of these questions that were left a bit open in the review are things I'm trying to answer with my study. For example, there was this question about the timing. How long does enhanced neuroplasticity last? Mm-hmm. And in animals, in mice at least, it appears to last between 3 and 5 days, although there's only really one study that looked at that very specific question. And so I use that to inform the design of my study. So we give people LSD. We measure neuroplasticity about 8 hours after doing that. We have them come in the next day, we measure it again. And then we have them come in again about a week later, and we measure it again. And so we have one measurement of neuroplasticity that's after 1 day and one after 1 week. And so this supposed 3 to 5 day window that you see in animal studies is in between there. And if that's correct, you would expect to see enhanced neuroplasticity 1 day after LSD, but not 1 week later. Or maybe it does last longer in humans. I don't know. That's what we're trying to find out.
Yeah. That's going to be the primary, like, if you were to envision yourself at your party, you got your PhD, like, would that be your thesis statement, or like what would your thesis be?
So first, we're trying to figure out whether psychedelics stimulate neuroplasticity in humans, and we're measuring that in ways that nobody has used before, or at least not published before. So what most studies have used is this BDNF in the blood, but as we've talked about, BDNF is a little bit unreliable. So we're using 2 different, basically brain stimulation techniques in order to measure it instead. One is with TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and one is based on EEG, electroencephalography, which is this electrode cap that measures your brain waves on your head. And basically, I don't want to get too technical with the techniques, but have you ever heard this phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together? That's basically a summary of neuroplasticity.
Okay, I like that. I never heard that before.
Neurons that fire together, wire together.
All right.
And that's always true. And so what we're doing in the study is before and after LSD, a big dose and a small dose so that we can compare. We don't expect the small dose to really do anything. We are artificially making certain neurons fire together, and then we're measuring how well they wired together using a couple different techniques. And that's an index of neuroplasticity that's much closer to the brain than peripheral blood, because it's not really clear that peripheral BDNF reflects brain BDNF. There's some questions about that.
That's fascinating, Abigail. I'm stoked for you. That's really cool.
You know what's really cool? We're not the only one doing it right now. So I have the healthy participants in my study. I know there's a group in London that's doing it with participants who have eating disorders, patients. And there's a group in the United States doing it with depressed patients. And so you'll get, all these studies are still running right now, as far as I know. And so you'll get these 3 groups, and we can maybe compare because they're using really similar techniques. So that'll be interesting to have all of that data in a couple of years.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I wanted to ask you this too, like, when we talk about, like, is there a positive or a negative charge to the molecule LSD, or does it attach with a positive or a negative charge in the to the synaptic gap, or however it charges in? Is there a positive and negative charge in the brain that these things are connecting to, and is that relevant?
Oh, you're asking questions. I actually don't know if LSD is positively or negatively charged, to be honest.
I grow mushrooms, and I'm pretty sure if I take like a powerful magnet, like a neodymium magnet, like I can feel like there's something there. Like if you take a magnet and you pick a fresh mushroom, like you can feel like that there. I should probably mark the North Pole and the South Pole and figure out what it is. But then I think that's there. And I got to think that, like, you have positive, like in your blood cells, right? There's positive and negatively charged particles going through your body. So, and when you talked about the magnetic resonance and the way the TMS, like, I'm wondering what role like magnetism and the electricity of the particles play in there. I think that could be something no one's talking about.
Yeah, I mean, that's well, we use it to measure things.
Okay.
In MRI, for example. MRI is based on the fact that there are positive and negative electrical charges in the brain. EEG as well.
Right.
In fact, EEG, so cells, of course, have a positive and negative charge. There's positive and negative ions going in and out of your brain cells and all of your cells all the time. It's essential. Can't live without it. And in EEG, we measure these charges, basically. So I don't know if LSD is positively or negatively charged. I want to go back to something. Can you did you just invent a new way to hunt for mushrooms? Like if they're super magnetic, you can just go out there with a magnet and gotta test it.
Well, I didn't want to talk about this, but it's in my family for generations. We were mushroom hunters with magnet. No, I'm just kidding. But I went and picked a bunch one time because I grow them from time to time. And I was sitting there and I had just bought this really cool neodymium magnet, like this super thick one. I'm like, this is bad to the bone, man. I had this idea that like if I was super high or if I took mushrooms that I could see electromagnetic waves. And so I bought like the green paper that you could see the magnetic waves through and stuff. And I did this experiment that was just all me, all alone. Like, okay, I'm going to focus. I'm going to see. Because, you see stuff moving, right? Like you see stuff breathing sometimes. And I'm like, I bet you like that's the electromagnetic waves moving through it. And if I can just get the paper. So anyways, long story longer, I was setting up this little exercise for myself and I picked some fresh mushrooms and I had my cool magnet there. And I was like, I wonder if these are there. And I was like, holy shit, it's a magnet, dude. Can you feel that? Of course, there's nobody here but me. And I'm like, dude, this totally works. I wish there was somebody here. So
Did you try it again later, like after the drug effects wore off?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there's something there. There's something there. I'm telling you.
Yeah.
A rare earth neodymium magnet.
With TMS, we use a giant magnet to stimulate the brain. We basically take advantage of the brain's electromagnetic properties. So what we do is we put this giant magnet over their motor cortex.
Okay.
And that stimulates a certain area in the motor cortex. We are looking for the area that controls this muscle right here. The abductor polaris brevis, I think it's called. Or polliculus, I'm forgetting. But if you stimulate that part of the motor cortex, what happens is this muscle moves.
Whoa.
So we are like basically not controlling their brain, but a little bit controlling their brain.
Totally controlling their brain.
Yeah.
See, now we're crossing the dark arts of the sciences where they're like getting in there, like, let me put this magnet. I heard a story one time where there's a back here, I forgot it was the right or left hand side, and they used a magnet. And I forgot if it was negative, the South Pole or the North Pole, but they did a survey and they found that like 30 minutes stimulating the back part of the brain would allow people's morality to be questioned. And the questions they were asking is like, would you punch a nun? Or, they asked these crazy questions. And then like, the more they stimulated that part of the brain, the more people were like, yeah, I think I probably would if I had to,
Whoa, I don't know that study. You got to send me that.
I will. Let me write it down. Punching the nun son.
Punching the nun study.
It's crazy, huh?
I hope they kept nuns far away from that.
I know, right? Okay, so have you read now in your work and on your study, sometimes you come across other fascinating people, and you've already spoken about some other studies that you're doing. But let's say that you had the freedom to pick another PhD right now, and they were all open. is there something in your mind that if you could have anyone besides this one, which because this is your favorite one and you're working with someone awesome, but if there was another one, what would that be?
Oh, and it's funded and everything. Wow, that would be
Let's
a
go
gift.
wild here. Let's just go way out there.
Yeah, I mean, okay, what's coming to mind right now is MDMA for couples therapy, actually.
I know a girl that does that.
Yeah, I know there are people who do it underground, and there have been a couple of like theoretical papers written on it, but it would be really interesting to see an actual study. I mean, there would be so many hurdles to jump through, but it would be interesting to see an actual study. And especially, for couples who really want to stay together, but just are having trouble working through their problems, I think it could potentially be really beneficial there.
Yeah. Do you think that so I have a question on that, and I have a question on MDMA, couples, and neurons, and you're the person to ask.
All right.
So, with the limited stuff that I have read, cognitive development in children is made better through mirror neurons. The biological parents have neurons, and then the child's have these mirror neurons. I'm wondering if, say you're together with this person you've loved for 20 years, do you yourself develop mirror neurons, you think? And
I'm not up to date on the mirror neurons literature, but if you have them, you always have them, and they're used for understanding other people's behavior in general. So I don't think you have specific mirror neurons for specific people, but they're used for example, if I make a movement with my hand, you can imagine how that feels, right?
Right.
Mirror neurons, supposedly. I'm not up to date on the literature. I remember there was some controversy over whether they actually exist. But basically, we, with or without them, we model other people's behavior and emotions. And that's one of the bases of empathy.
Do you think that, yeah, please.
Yeah, go ahead. I was just rambling to ask a question.
Do you think that seems to me one of the major issues in any sort of breakdown in couples, be it someone you love or a family member or a romantic relationship or a sibling relationship? There's breakdown of communication, and it seems that's what MDMA does, right? It seems to help with that facilitation of communication.
Yeah, and it makes things less threatening. So neurobiologically, it really reduces activity in the amygdala, which is it's sometimes called the brain's fear center, even though it does a lot more than that. But it makes basically anything safe to talk about, whether it's a trauma or a fight or whatever. And it also stimulates the production of oxytocin. By the way, LSD does this as well.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so that can facilitate some social bonding. And so you feel more connected to the other person. MDMA also appears to stimulate neuroplasticity, at least in rats, I think. So you have all these effects together. You've greater social bonding, reduced fear reactions, and neuroplasticity, which really, I think, could give you an ability to reset your relationship with somebody and return to the basics of it. Why are you together in the first place? What's really important here? And maybe also it can help you restructure your model of that person. If you've started to see them as somebody who always has bad intentions, or who is out to get you, or who is selfish, maybe you can rethink your model of that person and see things from their perspective.
Yeah. So let's talk about restructuring your perception and like the idea that psychedelics can do that. I talked to this guy today, fascinating guy from Australia. He's the president of the Psychedelic Association out there. And he told me this funny but amazing story about one time when he was, when he was younger. I'm going to get him in trouble. When he was a lot younger, he did what everybody does. And he go to this party and he bought LSD from a stranger, because that's what you do, right?
That's okay.
When you're young and dumb, that's what all kinds of people do. And so the idea was that he said he started feeling it come on a little bit. And then all of a sudden, like the slow creep, just slowly coming over you. And he noticed this gentleman across the table, and he saw this thing on his arm, and he just became so enamored by it. And he was, 3 or 4 feet away, and he's like, that is amazing. And he went over and got himself a closer look. And then the way he explained it was so funny. He's like, after a while goes by, the whole party stops and everyone's just looking at me, looking at this guy's arm. And I asked the guy, I'm like, what is this thing on your arm? And the guy's like, that's a watch, That's so funny, right? But the reason I brought it up is that, and the moral, I don't know if there's a moral behind the story, but the story was like, it'll like psychedelics strip away the hypnosis, or they strip away the label that was given to you, or the label or the idea that you have reconstructed a million times and don't even do it consciously anymore. It's just boom, it's right there for you. And it's that same process, I believe, of stripping away, whether you're whether you're a weirdo staring at some guys watching a party, or you're a couple reinventing the relationship you're with somebody. It's weird to see that same process in a relationship versus in a relationship with a watch. But I guess it shouldn't be that different. You're in relationship to it, right?
Yeah, well, MDMA often doesn't have these perceptual
Right.
breakdowns to the same degree LSD does. But yeah, LSD disrupts higher order sensory processing, which basically means you might see the parts of a watch and process the very basic structure, the lines, the circles, the colors, but you don't put it all together and know that it's a watch. And yeah, I'm not really sure if that applies to MDMA, but maybe I see kind of the conceptual connection there, that you're maybe breaking down a relationship into its parts, taking it apart a little bit, looking behind the curtain, seeing how you tick in the moment when you're interacting with that person. What makes me react, and why do I react? And what are the mechanisms in my mind that lead to that process of maybe overreacting to somebody when they ask you to clean the dishes or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's never about the dishes. It's never about the dishes.
It never is. Just do them though. That's what I do.
Yeah.
Yep, you're right. I did that.
Yep.
So now I got 2 points. Now I have 2 different branches on this tree that I want to take. And the first branch is this idea of, I think in the future, what some interesting tests that may come up, some interesting clinical trials that may come up in the future is one psychedelic better for one particular problem? Like perhaps psilocybin is better for PTSD and MDMA is better for couples therapy. Or maybe there's like, okay, we're going to give you 2 weeks of MDMA and then we're going to follow it up with the psilocybin. I think that maybe even different strains of different psilocybins, or maybe we'll get to see these different types of, or strains, or, you 4-ACO DMT versus 4, I don't know, whatever the other ones are, but like maybe these different analogs will be enough to treat different particular maladies in the future. Like that's a kind of an awesome thing to think about, right?
Yeah. What's really crystallizing now is that it seems that MDMA is particularly good for trauma-based issues because, as we talked about earlier, it reduces activity in the amygdala. It makes things safe to look at. LSD can do that, but it's a little more of a wild card, I think.
Right.
Yeah. So actually here in Switzerland, I don't know if you know this, but we have a compassionate use program. They don't call it compassionate use, but it's quite similar, where psychedelic therapy is legal in some small exceptional cases outside of clinical trials. And what doctors here will often do is start people with MDMA because it's a bit easier to handle. And then if that goes well, maybe they continue on to LSD. Maybe like 3 months later. So they do a lot of therapy in between, but MDMA is kind of a sort of a safe bet, especially for people with trauma related problems. And as far as LSD versus psilocybin and all that, I don't know if the differences between them would be super significant, but it's definitely worth looking into. They're quite similar. One question is whether LSD's longer duration of effect is advantageous or not. Maybe there's more time for somebody to work through something while in the psychedelic state. Maybe not. But it's a really interesting area of research. MDMA has a bit of a different pharmacology. So there's a clear reason why it's different and why it might be more suitable for some things than others. On the one hand, it makes things safe. On the other hand, you don't have this, you don't have the perceptual changes or really transcendental mystical experiences happen less often with MDMA. Ego death happens less often, or potentially not really at all. So if you want those therapeutic benefits, you would have to go with LSD.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking this too. Are you like sometimes I have had the experience, and I think that maybe other people have this too, is this inability to talk when you're on psychedelics. Like, what's going
Every
on
time,
there?
every time. Well, yeah, in the study, people have it every time,
Yeah.
and I warn them about it so they don't get nervous.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, they have the feeling, it is so amazing how normal someone can seem while they're tripping out of their minds. But people will tell me they feel like they can't talk, and meanwhile they're talking like the whole time.
Ah.
But what they're experiencing probably is that they're saying things, but it's not quite what they meant.
Mhm.
So they have something that they cannot put into words because they don't have the words for it. I think that's what's going on. So partially they're just overwhelmed with all the sensory experiences. You would also probably find it hard to talk. For example, let's say you're driving and you've got a passenger in your car trying to talk to you, and you come to a really complicated intersection and someone's doing something stupid and you have to watch out for
Right.
them. It's also hard to talk then because you're overwhelmed with all of the sensory input and the task you have to do. So I think that's part of it. But it's also that people just don't have the words for what they're experiencing.
Right.
I really like to ask people afterward if the LSD experience was what they expected, because many people
That's a
are
great question.
not experienced with psychedelics in this study.
Yeah.
And they always say, no way, there's no way I could have expected that. Because even though I explained to them beforehand approximately what they should expect, there's no way I can actually give them an idea of what it's like in words. The best I can do is explain what might happen so that they recognize it when it does happen and don't feel scared of it. But it's really hard to imagine what it's like, obviously, without ever having experienced it, because we don't have the words for it.
Yeah. I got some more questions, but I have someone's chiming in here and they would love to ask you a question, Abigail. So let's see what they say.
Sure.
Nice. So this one's from Kaika. He's a fellow Hawaiian over here. What's up, Kaika? Thanks for chiming in over here, my friend. He wants to know, are there any studies on elevated ketone levels through ketogenic diet while on psychedelics? Does that improve neuroplasticity?
The short answer is no. Sadly. I don't know of any. I don't think there are any studies on the combination of special diets and psychedelics, unless you count studies of ayahuasca in which people fasted beforehand, which is common practice.
Right.
Sadly.
Yeah, that's good. I'm super stoked, Kaika. Thanks for chiming in, man. It's always, we got to get together, man. I miss you, brother. You know what? Sometimes I wonder if there's so many people going to like these retreats in South America, and they seem to be like white people from the States over here. And sometimes I wonder, like, you can have a great experience in a different country, but we had talked earlier about culture and language and getting lost in translation and the way we think about things. And it seems to me that if you're having even some sort of breakthrough experience on ayahuasca in the middle of Brazil, might you be better off having a breakthrough experience in a church in Illinois? Like, wouldn't you be able to integrate it better?
I think there is something to that. Yeah. So one thing is that people, when you go to another country with another culture and another language, you leave your support system behind. And especially if you have a challenging experience, but also with a good one, many people need to talk about it afterward to process it. They need that support system. And so I think that sometimes leads to problems. I know a couple people and have read accounts of this where people go have an ayahuasca ceremony. Maybe it goes well, maybe it doesn't, but there's no one there to talk to about it necessarily. You have to get on a plane, go back home, deal with that flight, and then maybe you have someone at home you can talk about it with. But in the immediate aftermath of it, your support system that you would normally have is often not there. And then there's this problem of not understanding the ceremony, basically. Right. I've heard this from also people who have an indigenous background. They'll say that the songs, for example, that they sing during the ceremony, if you're not embedded in that culture, you may not understand what the songs are trying to do for you or what they mean. And so there's, it's different from the way we use music in the West and in therapy and in also studies with healthy people. So yeah, maybe, I mean, I personally, I don't know if I would take psychedelics in a church. Some people have kind of a difficult background with religion, but a place that you understand and feel comfortable in, I think, is essential. And it's not, especially if it's your first time, if you're not super experienced, I don't think it's a good idea to go away from your support system in order to have an experience like that.
Yeah, I think that's great feedback for people and great advice for people. Speaking of religion and psychedelics, are you familiar with like the Good Friday experiments about the
Yeah,
people that
yeah.
pretty
Of course.
interesting, right?
Yeah. I mean, the connection between psychedelics and religion is pretty obvious because psychedelics cause spiritual experiences. I wouldn't be surprised if they started a few religions.
Yeah, when I talked to Dr. Strassman, I was asking him. I said, we know that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and it seems to move in this helical motion and stuff. I'm like, do you think that potentially what we're seeing right now could be shut down the same way it was in the 60s? And he just, without even blinking, is like, absolutely. He's like,
Mhm.
there's going to be another Jonestown. There's going to be another Manson, and it's not the drug's fault, but it can be blamed on the drug. And he went into like how that can be. And just us talking about people going to South America, for just a note for men or women that go to South America, you may not know if the songs are saying, but if you get some weird guy touching you, that's the same thing. That's like molesting you. So get out of there. Don't be part of that.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
some crazy stuff there.
Yeah, no matter where you are. Yeah.
Yeah, right. You're in a vulnerable state and people can take advantage of you. And it's a
Yeah.
horrible thing to think about.
Yeah. I mean, I think Strassman's absolutely right there, just to throw in my 2 cents.
Yeah.
There's also, there's a different set and setting or historical context for psychedelics now. Maybe they wouldn't be shut down for the same reasons as they were shut down in the 60s, but there could be some other reason, and people, what do you do with a drug that can send people to heaven or hell, that puts them in a vulnerable state? It's not an easy thing to integrate into a society.
Yeah, it's hard to define those things. It's not only just the feelings about them, but in some ways you can kind of see why people shit. This is way too powerful because people are going to get crazy.
Yeah.
It brings me back to this idea of language and losing the ability to communicate. And I want to just stick there for a minute because I want to try to tie that to deconstructing watches or relationships. When we get to a point on a psychedelic where language fails, I think there's some real magic there. I think that allows you to, like, let's say that the guy sees the watch, and the way you broke it down, Abigail, was really elegant and beautiful. You're able to, the higher functioning stops, but you're able to see the pieces there. But when the higher functioning begins to return, might that be the opportunity where you can reconstruct it differently? And if you can do that, might that be the pathway to original ideas? Might that be the pathway to coming up to solutions to problems that people haven't found yet? That moment, that magic moment, or the ability, whatever's happening in the brain, that time, I think, is a pivotal time to reconstruct things and see the world differently. Maybe that's where some of the magic can come from.
Yeah, I think so. When language fails, all you have left is your perception, your sensory perception, or your emotions, whatever's going on right now. There's no room for you to interpret it or limit it with your words.
Right. That's well said.
All you have left is this sensory perception. And also in meditation, to bring it back to that, if you simply focus on sensory perception, often there's nothing wrong with it, or maybe it's even beautiful. And so whatever's going wrong in your life just isn't there if you just focus on the moment right now, unless you're, I don't know, in the middle of being in a car accident or something like that. But usually that's not the case. Not the time to meditate. Not the time to meditate. And then when you put it back together, it's a way for you to readapt to the world as it is now, not as it was. And my instinct about psychedelic therapy is that it's going to be particularly useful for people whose disorder is rooted in the past, whether trauma or something else. Maybe you had a really stressful time in your life and you started to notice you were getting burnt out and depressed. And then the stress was over at some point, but you didn't quite readapt to the world being good again. And eventually people can develop depression from situations like that. Chronic stress is a really big risk factor for depression and also for other psychological problems. So maybe psychedelics can help you readapt to the world as it is now, once the problematic circumstances or the trauma is over.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a question. You can tell me you don't want to answer it.
Okay.
It seems to me like that, when you say that, the way you said it about depression and why that is. It sounds like you have people that you help out, or you're people that you have close to that have depression. Is that true? And if so, have you tried to give them psychedelics?
As a matter of fact, it is true. I have not tried to give them psychedelics. I think that's something that people have to decide on their own.
Right.
You know, people, I have some family members, for example, and they know what I do. I talk about the research, but, you know, I'm not going to push anything
Right.
on anybody. Yeah, I mean, of course, I know people who have used psychedelics in that way, and it was helpful, but you have to want it. It has to be your decision. It can't be somebody pushing it on you.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's also, you know, a lot of people, most people even, probably don't want to do anything illegal because of the risks associated with that. And it's, you know, it's unfortunate that there's no way for most people to really safely access these substances right now, at least not the people I know.
Yeah.
So that's really too bad.
It's interesting. Like, I didn't think about it, but yeah, doing something illegal while depressed is like just sprinkling some anxiety on top of that, right? Like, that's crazy.
Yeah. And maybe you don't know what it is. You don't know where to get it. You don't have someone to sit with you who understands what this is. There's a lot of issues. Whereas if there was a therapy center, for example, that you could go to, consult with a therapist, get some real therapy first, and then have the psychedelic session. That's what they do in Switzerland for those exceptional cases. Then it's quite safe, and you're supported. We're back to support systems. You know, if you just go buy LSD from some guy and then try to use it to cure your depression, you may not have a support system. Who in your life is going to understand why the hell you did that?
You might not even get LSD.
Yeah, you might get something else. Yeah.
That's so crazy.
Yeah.
So I want to shift gears. Like, I'm sure, I know you pay attention to like all these things that are happening in the US, and there's all these laws coming out right now. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on, there's some hot button issues over here, and I'm going to throw them out here and you tell me what you think about them.
All right.
There's some people that are really worried about big pharma getting into the world of psychedelics and making, you know, licensing and just pushing out everybody. They're pushing out the Marina Sabias for the Elon Musk. What's your take on
that? Yeah. Gosh. Hey, random question. I didn't look at the news again this morning, but I know there was a vote in Colorado.
It passed.
It passed.
Yeah, 121, nice. I think it was, or 122.
Nice. Yeah, that'll be something to watch. That'll be something to watch. I'm always on a delay over here in Switzerland when there's elections.
You're time traveling.
Yeah. Okay, nice. Yeah, that's interesting. Anyway, yeah. You know, I think, I don't know. I'm not an expert on this stuff. I have an opinion. It might be bullshit. But if your main concern is the patients, I think the best way forward would be to research these substances as they are, integrate them into the existing healthcare system, including getting insurance to cover them. If I take a patient-centered approach, I don't really see the need to replace what we already have with new substances. New substances may be worth researching for various reasons, but we already have psilocybin. And I know there are people who think we don't actually need that much capital in order to research them and integrate them into existing medical systems. What's really nice that pharmaceutical companies can do is they can afford big studies. With of course their own slight variance on psilocybin or whatever it is, Comp 360. You know, I appreciate those studies. I'm happy to see them. I'm happy to see that they are researching larger groups of people and slightly more diverse groups of patients who maybe are not so highly screened to only have this particular type of depression, because that's not really how it works in the real world. But in the long term, what I would like to see is these substances being well researched as they are. And if that research shows positive results, also in larger trials, that they be integrated into the medical system that we already have. Spiritual use aside, just commenting on the medical use, maybe there should be more than one option for people in how they want to take these substances. But yeah, for me, I see the value in having companies that have a lot of money to run big trials. But I don't know that we need all of these new drugs, because we already have LSD, we have psilocybin. And if you're just tweaking it so that you can patent it, it's not really, I'm sure they have their reasons, but it's not necessarily a patient-centered approach.
Yeah, more of the profit-driven approach,
Yeah.
right?
And the problem is research is expensive. This is not an
Sure,
easy problem. Like
sure.
every researcher at a university, or almost every researcher, has problems getting funding. And so they solve that problem, but
Right.
maybe they create another problem as they solve it. And I don't know that I'm a good judge of which problem is worse.
It's well said. I
Yeah.
like the way you spoke about that. Okay, here's the next one for you. This one takes me building a little bit of a foundation. So
All right.
let's I have this theory. Actually, I got to give credit to David Hildreth, who he gave me the Maria Sabina versus Elon Musk line, which is a great line. But thanks, David. And so this is one I ran by him. And LSD or psychedelics as a Trojan horse. And I use specifically psilocybin in this one because it seems to give, at least for me, this feeling of the fuck am I doing? And so what do you think about psilocybin as a Trojan horse for big pharma? Like all of a sudden they start making these analogs and then they come to this conclusion of like, you know what? We as the administrators of this should probably take it. So they take it, they start giving it to their people, and then they realize how corrupt some of the practices are. And they put a stop to it. Psilocybin is a Trojan horse in the pharmaceutical industry. Abigail, what do you think?
I think psychedelics can't reliably change people's beliefs.
Damn it.
Yeah, I know, damn it. But it's a good thing because if you
Right.
had a drug that reliably changed people's beliefs in a particular direction, somebody could really misuse it, even if you could also theoretically imagine a good use for it. So if you take somebody who's based their entire career and livelihood on, let's say, drug development, and they take psilocybin, psychedelics are powerful, but I don't know that they're powerful enough to make someone drop their entire life most of the time. So here's the bubble. Pop. Sorry.
How dare you, Abigail?
I just don't think it's going to work that way. It would be nice, but I don't expect it to work that way.
Okay, let's shift gears to there were some interesting people throughout time that were administered LSD. And one of my favorites for interesting reasons is our good friend, Ted Kaczynski. Do you remember that guy? Like that guy took a bunch of LSD, a mathematician out of Harvard.
The name sounds familiar, but you might have to remind me. Ted Kaczynski.
He goes by the name of the Unabomber sometimes.
Oh, okay. That
it's so fascinating to me that when you talked about it can be used for nefarious reasons, that person comes up to me, number one. A second study was like, did you see the trials of like the CIA where they would, back in the 60s, where they would take the Johns in there and get them all dosed up on stuff like that? I think there's been research that we're not privy to that talks about using LSD or psychedelics as some form of mind control. Are you familiar with any of that kind of studies?
There's a great book on that. It's called Acid Dreams. It was written by a journalist who went through all of the documentation from those CIA studies and other studies after they got declassified. Okay. Acid Dreams, I forget the author, but it's good. Lots of stuff in there. Apparently at the CIA, they used to give people surprise LSD doses in their coffee.
Surprise!
Until somebody died and then they stopped.
Now, is that something that you might focus on your research?
Surprise LSD.
I'm just
threaten everybody in the lab. You better be nice to me or watch your coffee.
Just point to the coffee. I'm here today. It's so funny to think about. All right.
Yeah, so I was aware of that research. I don't remember the rest of the question though.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. Sometimes I wonder if this idea of psychedelics it's not the right word, but I'll try to flesh it out here. So I know you can't see more when you take psychedelics, but it seems to me that if you have a heightened sense of awareness, maybe you are becoming more aware of a situation that allows you to see more. Sometimes I think that maybe, and this is just me pulling shit out of my ass again, just so everybody knows, like maybe it's connected, like the language and the place where you go where language fails. Maybe this is, could this be some sort of new sense we're developing, or a new sort of frontier that we're exploring? Like, what do you think?
Well, you do see more, literally.
Is that because your pupils are so dilated?
Well, not really. It's because there's a part of the brain called the thalamus. The
Okay.
thalamus. It's sometimes called the door to consciousness because it acts as a sort of filter. So
Ah.
right now, where you are sitting, a lot of your sensory perception is being filtered out because it's not important. Your brain has determined it's not important. Like, for example, unless I really focus on it, I don't usually consciously perceive myself sitting in my chair because it's not important. I don't need to constantly be aware of that. And a big node in that filter process in the brain is the thalamus. So whenever sensory perception goes, for example, through your eyes or through your fingers or wherever, through your nose, it passes through the thalamus, gets filtered, and then it goes up to the cortex, which is sort of where conscious experience happens. On psychedelics, the thalamus's ability to filter is reduced. So you actually are seeing more and feeling more and hearing more than you usually are. That's one of the things psychedelics do in the brain. They reduce the filter.
Wow.
So there's less that's filtered out, which means you get a lot of irrelevant information too, by the way. There's a reason you have a filter.
That's true.
Yeah. But so you do see more and you feel more as well. And some people also feel that they think more. They feel like their thoughts are just racing by. They can't keep up. So it's
Is
just,
there
in general, there's just more going on.
Yeah, that's fascinating to know because is there any, I wonder, are you aware of any studies on the long-term use of psychedelics and the reduction of the filter in the hypothalamus? Like, it seems to me that prolonged use may have some effect on the hypothalamus. Do we know anything about that?
Prolonged use as in long-term effects of one dose? Because there is at least one study on that. As far as multiple doses, I don't know of anything because you'd have to get people in the wild, so to speak, who do that and then measure them. And there's so many other influences on those people. And a big problem, unfortunately, in trying to get that population is it's very hard to find somebody who consumes psychedelics long-term but doesn't take other drugs. And so you'd also get the influence of the other drugs. So that I would actually love to do a study like that. Also with neuroplasticity, I would be really interested if people who use a lot of psychedelics have any kind of long-term effect on neuroplasticity. But it's hard to dissociate the effects of psychedelics from the effects of other drugs because it's difficult to find a population of people who only does psychedelics. They're out there, but it's not so easy to find them.
Yeah. What other drugs would disqualify them?
Well, party drugs, lots of alcohol, cocaine, whatever people take it when they also take psychedelics. So a lot of it is, I used to live in Berlin, so I saw the party scene.
Right.
And people will take MDMA and LSD, but then also speed. And so I don't know if speed enhances neuroplasticity. I have no idea, but there could be the effects of those as well. Also potentially detrimental effects depending on how often you take it. So it's all the drugs would be kind of together.
Yeah. Is speed like methamphetamines?
It is amphetamine.
Ah.
Yeah.
Do you think is Adderall is an amphetamine too, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very, very closely related to methamphetamine. I think it's just missing one. I'm going to say bullshit. One methyl group or something like that. It's very, very close.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm hopeful that we're seeing. I read in the paper someday like there's a shortage of Adderall. Like people are all cringing and stuff. We're gonna lose it. But I think it's nice to see it being replaced with like psychedelics. I think it just makes for a better community. But
that's quite interesting. Whether microdosing in particular, first of all, is safe because this heart issue. We need to know that. But second of all, whether it could help people who have ADHD because it has a bit of a stimulating effect that's different from caffeine or other stimulants, Adderall. I wonder if that could help some people there. I think there's at least one study on that going on in the Netherlands, if I remember correctly.
That's a great study. That should yield a lot of results right there.
I'm really interested because that's one of the first effects people get with microdosing, and that's one of there's been all this microdosing research that comes up with null results a lot of the time. Like they don't find anything, but one thing they do find relatively consistently is that there's a little energy boost. People feel less tired and they feel just a bit stimulated. And who knows if it works differently in people who have ADHD, because that's the deal with Adderall is that in a normal person, it's a stimulant, but in someone with real ADHD, it calms them down, helps them focus a bit more. I don't know if it'll be like that with microdosing. That'll be really interesting to see. I heard it once described as a weird cup of coffee that lasts all day.
That's a great description of it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
I know we're getting close to our end here, but I have just a few more questions and then I'll let you go.
All right.
I'm wondering if sometimes if you take mushrooms, then you'll see the lights come on. And what I mean by that is like the color's a little brighter, the bird song's a little sweeter. Do you think that is the effect of the hypothalamus filter kind of being pushed down?
Thalamus. The
Thalamus.
hypothalamus is
Thank
something
you.
else.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yes, I think so because there's more sensory perception. You're
Right.
pulled into the moment, and the reason there's more sensory perception is because your thalamus is not filtering as much.
Yeah.
So
I think
that's one thing that psychedelics. Sorry for interrupting,
yeah.
but that's one thing psychedelics do relatively consistently is they bias the brain's processing in favor of sensory information and against associative information temporarily.
Hmm. I'm so excited. Like I think that you're going to see my young niece is getting ready to go to college. She's going to do this. She wants to go to college for sports medicine. And I think that there's a lot of evidence that you could see psychedelics playing a role in sports medicine for people that like they already go and meditate and stuff. Like I could see them being on a retreat or even a micro dosing where they shoot as a team or they practice as a team. I got to think that's going to help group cohesion. So I'm just really excited for the future of psychedelics. I'm excited there's people like you, Abigail, out there who's going to be possibly pioneering new research, and it's really exciting for me. So I'm really thankful for your time. This has been an incredible pleasure for me, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I know our listeners enjoyed it. And so thank you to that. Now, before I let you go, what do you have coming up? What is on the books for you, and what are you excited about? And where can people find you?
Oh, well, thanks so much. This was my first podcast, as we established before we started recording. So thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a blast. What's next for me? So I'm still running this LSD study to figure out if LSD enhances neuroplasticity. And if so, what that means. So we're also measuring learning ability after people take the psychedelic drug to see if there's a relationship between, well, first of all, to see if LSD enhances learning ability in this very specific domain we're measuring it in, and if that's at all related to neuroplasticity. So I'm really excited to see the results of that. It'll take a while, but yeah, I really want to see. And I'm also really excited for this potential upcoming study in the older cohort, in the older adults, because for me, I'm right now completely agnostic about whether psychedelics are going to be able to improve cognitive decline in any way. And so I'm really interested to see that data. We're also interested in characterizing the side effects of psychedelics more exactly. That's a project that's starting to run right now. Side effects very broadly, of course. But there's almost no good data on that. And it's a very concrete thing to research. And so we're going to try and contribute some research on side effects, also within the LSD study, but in other studies as well. And yeah, so what's next for me is basically that. And I have a few other little side projects. And at some point I'll get my PhD, and then we'll see.
Yeah. Well, I think you're going to help a lot of people, and I'm really lucky and thankful to be doing what I'm doing and get to spend time and talk to you and learn about it. So I hope in the future we can talk more and we can figure out some more problems. And I got some panels coming up. Maybe you can be part of those if you're willing to do that. And
sure, that sounds fun.
okay, I'm gonna end it right here. But I want to talk to you for one more second after this.
Okay,
so
perfect.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Aloha. Have a fantastic day. We'll see you next time.